For most of human history, the Pacific Ocean was not an empty space on a map. It was a moving system carrying life across immense distances. Long before Europeans imagined the world as a globe to be crossed, people living along its shores understood the sea as both a provider and a threat, a force that could connect distant lands without warning or intention. This is a story about that ocean, and about the possibility that on rare occasions, it carried people from ancient Japan to the shores of the Americas, leaving behind not colonies or empires, but fragments, such as stories, tools, and unanswered questions. What follows is a story that lives on the margins of history and science. It is not a tale of certainty, but of possibility. A careful walk along the edge between evidence and imagination, where questions linger longer than answers, and where the Pacific Ocean is not a barrier, but a highway. One of the most intriguing pieces of this puzzle lies buried far from the coast, in the interior of North America. In Idaho, archaeologists uncovered a series of ancient spear points dating back approximately 16,000 years. These points, associated with what is known as the Western stem tradition, differ significantly from the more famous Clovis points found elsewhere in the Americas. They are narrower, stemmed rather than fluted, and designed for rehafting and reuse. What caught the attention of some researchers was their resemblance to stone tools found in northern Japan, particularly in Hokkaido, dating to roughly the same period. The manufacturing techniques, pressure flaking patterns, basil shaping, and edge geometry appear strikingly similar. This observation gave rise to what is sometimes called the Hokkaido Connection. The hypothesis does not suggest that Japanese toolmakers traveled directly to Idaho. Rather, it proposes that both technologies may share a common ancestral tradition, carried by coastal peoples moving along the Pacific Rim during the late Ice Age. At that time, sea levels were lower, shorelines were broader, and coastal migration routes may have extended from Northeast Asia into the Americas. In this view, the similarities between Hokkaido and Idaho are not evidence of later contact, but echoes of a much older shared technological heritage. Even so, the idea reinforces a larger point. The Pacific was a corridor of movement far earlier than once was believed. Around 14,000 years ago, as glaciers retreated and coastlines reshaped themselves, human societies across the Pacific Rim were adapting to a world of rising seas. Long before the written record, the northern Pacific Rim was home to some of the most technologically sophisticated hunter-gatherers the world has ever known. In what is now Japan, the Jōmon culture flourished for thousands of years, beginning as early as 14,000 years ago. These were maritime people. They harvested deep-sea fish, built seaworthy vessels, crafted complex fishing gear, and developed stone technologies that archaeologists still study for their precision and durability. Long before the arrival of rice agriculture, or centralized states, the Jōmon, named for the distinctive cord-marked patterns they impressed into clay, were making some of the earliest pottery in the world. Their ceramics range in date from roughly 14,000 to 300 BC, emerging long before many Old World traditions we take for granted. These pots were not purely utilitarian. They were elaborate, often decorated with cord-marked patterns, deep incisions, and dramatic rims that flared outward like flames. The word Jōmon itself means cord-marked, a reference to the twisted fibers pressed into wet clay thousands of years ago. Around 3000 BC, halfway across the Pacific in what is today coastal Ecuador, another pottery tradition appeared, that of the Valdivia culture, one of the earliest ceramic-making societies in the Americas. The culture produced ceramics that startled archaeologists when they were first studied in the mid-20th century. Some researchers asked a provocative question: could these similarities be more than coincidence? Certain Valdivia vessels, especially their incised decoration and coiled construction, bore a visual resemblance to Jōmon ceramics. In the 1960s, archaeologist Emilio Estrada and colleagues suggested that this similarity might reflect real contact, perhaps even net-borne or drift voyages across the North Pacific. The idea was not that Jōmon people intentionally set out to cross the Pacific, but that small groups, perhaps fishermen, may have been carried eastward by powerful ocean currents. The Kuroshio Current, flowing north along Japan and then eastward into the North Pacific, is capable of transporting floating debris, and theoretically boats, across thousands of miles. Experimental archaeology has shown that even relatively simple watercraft, if caught in the right current and storm system, can drift from East Asia toward the Americas in a matter of months. The Kuroshio Current, often called the Pacific's Gulf Stream, flows northward along Japan's coasts and then eastward across the open ocean. Modern oceanography shows that debris, vessels, and even sea creatures can travel this route in surprising numbers. Post-tsunami debris from Japan reached North America in the 2010s, confirming what drift theory long ago predicted. Yet drift is random, slow, and rarely survivable for crews without preparation. Another question researchers asked themselves was, what if Jōmon seafarers, or people influenced by their techniques, reached the coasts of South America and introduced ceramic traditions there? Supporters of the hypothesis point to more than just surface-level similarities. They note parallels in ceramic construction methods, such as coil building and firing techniques. They argue that the sudden appearance of pottery in Valdivia without clear local antecedents suggests an external influence. But the scientific debate is far from settled. Critics argue that similar pottery styles can emerge independently. Clay behaves the same way everywhere, they say, and human hands solve similar problems in similar ways. They note that the genetic evidence does not support a direct Jōmon contribution to South American populations, and that there is a vast chronological gap between early Jōmon ceramics and Valdivia pottery that complicates the case for direct contact. Detractors also point out that similarities must be significant enough to exceed coincidence or independent invention. While early Jōmon pottery is indeed old, the styles that resemble Valdivia ceramics do not predate them in a clearly traceable way. And archaeologists note that pottery decoration worldwide tends to exhibit a limited range of solutions, simple motifs driven by human hands confronting clay rather than cultural borrowing. The majority of archaeologists today view the Jōmon-Valdivia link as implausible. They argue that the resemblance likely reflects parallel invention, similar problems solved with similar techniques, not a trans-Pacific voyage. But it remains one of the earliest and most enduring hypotheses of trans-Pacific contact. And the debate did something valuable. It opened a window into deeper questions about ancient seafaring and oceanic connectivity. As time moved forward, the Pacific world grew more interconnected, not necessarily by design, but by drift. Historians have observed hundreds of documented drift events in more recent centuries, late medieval and early modern, when Japanese vessels were blown into the currents and washed ashore in Alaska, British Columbia, and the Pacific Northwest. These cases, however, postdate Columbus and appear in historical records. Even these provide a scientific baseline. If drift can carry a 19th century Japanese ship thousands of miles across the Pacific, then the physical possibility, not necessarily probability, of earlier drift voyages cannot be dismissed outright. But possibility is not proof. As we move east, toward the forests and the fjords of the Pacific Northwest, we enter a world rich with oral tradition. Indigenous communities, from the Coast Salish, Makah, Tlingit, and others, have shared stories of strange vessels and outsiders washed ashore after storms. Some speak of boats unlike local dugouts, fragile crafts separated from their world by vast waters. In certain traditions, these arrivals are remembered as teachers, outsiders who married into the community, or tragic figures who did not survive. Others emphasize unusual materials, especially iron. Before European contact, indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest did not smelt iron, though they valued meteoritic iron in any workable metal they encountered. Legends speak of iron tools that did not shatter like stones, blades that held their edge, materials that came from the sea rather than from known trade routes. Further north, among Inuit and Yupik communities in Alaska, oral traditions describe encounters with outsiders, arriving by sea, sometimes in damaged boats, sometimes bringing metal tools. These figures are often remembered as tragic, powerful, or dangerous, people who did not belong to the land, and often did not survive long after arrival. Anthropologists caution that such stories cannot be read as straightforward historical records. Oral traditions are symbolic, layered, and shaped by centuries of retelling, but they also preserve memory in ways written records cannot. Some researchers have suggested that these legends may reflect rare drift arrivals from East Asia, including Japan. Others argue that they could refer to later European or Russian encounters, or serve as mythic explanations for the appearances of new materials. Yet rigorous archaeological work along the northwest coast has not produced unambiguous Asian artifacts predating European contact. No distinctly Asian ceramics, metal tools, or ship remnants securely dated to the pre-Columbian era. Genetic studies add another layer. Modern indigenous populations of the Pacific Northwest show overwhelming ancestry consistent with ancient migrations across Beringia thousands of years before Columbus. There is no clear genetic signal of Japanese admixture that would suggest even occasional prehistoric settlement by East Asian castaways. This doesn't negate every hypothesis. It simply emphasizes that such events, if they occurred, were extraordinarily rare and left no detectable biological footprint. By the first millennium AD, Japan had entered new cultural phases, Yayoi, Kofun, and later the early historic period. Seafaring had improved, but so had risk. Japanese vessels were not built for open ocean crossings. Japan's seafaring technology remained largely coastal. Japanese ships were well suited for fishing and regional trade. They lacked keels, relied on square sails, and were vulnerable to storms. They were designed for coastal travel, river mouths, and inland seas. When storms struck, control was easily lost. Historical records from Japan describe vessels blown off course, sometimes never seen again. In later centuries, particularly during the Edo period, these ships were known as drift ships. Records from Japan between 1633 and 1854 indicate that there were over 1,000 Japanese ships that were lost at sea due to shogunate-mandated hull designs that made them intentionally unseaworthy for deep ocean travel to maintain Japan's policy of isolation. As history moved forward, the possibility of accidental contact remained, even as intentional long-distance navigation did not. According to anthropologist George Quimby, there are approximately 187 Japanese vessels estimated to have drifted to the Americas between 500 and 1750 AD. This number was developed to account for what are perceived to be pre-contact influences in the Pacific Northwest. Of the documented historical drifts, roughly 33 to 34 cases involve ships actually washing up on the North American shores. In these early recorded cases, at least 222 living crewmen were rescued or found on land, indicating that many wrecks were actually successful, if accidental, trans-Pacific voyages. While most documented cases occur after European contact with the Americas, researchers have asked whether similar events could have happened centuries earlier, leaving little or no written trace. The North Pacific is uniquely suited for such accidents. Ships lost near Japan can be drawn into a vast clockwise circulation, eastward across open ocean, then south along the coast of North America. Drift simulations and modern debris tracking confirm this route. Supporters of the Japanese contact hypotheses suggest that occasional drift voyages could explain the oral traditions of indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest that hint at possible contact. A single shipwreck, they argue, would leave minimal archaeological evidence but could still echo through oral memory. Skeptics counter that many of these stories could just as easily refer to later European arrivals, or function as mythic explanations for cultural exchange rather than records of actual events. Physical evidence along the Pacific Northwest coast is similarly ambiguous. A handful of artifacts, iron fragments, unusual woodworking techniques, or structural anomalies have been proposed as possible signs of Asian contact. But in nearly every case, alternative explanations exist, including post-contact trade, contamination, or misinterpretation. Genetic studies have been especially influential in shaping modern consensus. Large-scale analyses of indigenous American DNA show overwhelming ancestry derived from ancient populations that entered the Americas via Beringia tens of thousands of years ago. While there are hints of limited later gene flow from Asia and Arctic populations, there is no clear genetic signal pointing to pre-Columbian Japanese admixture in the Pacific Northwest or beyond. That absence does not completely rule out contact, but it does suggest that if it occurred, it was rare, small scale, and left little lasting biological impact. As the centuries passed, the likelihood of undocumented contact diminished. By the late medieval period, indigenous societies along the Pacific coast were complex, populous, and deeply rooted. Any significant foreign presence would have been absorbed, remembered, or recorded in some form. And yet, the ocean continued to carry things across its surface. Perhaps the most controversial chapter in this story takes us inland, far from ocean waves, to the high desert mesas of New Mexico. For decades, anthropologist Nancy Yaw Davis has argued for an unexpected connection, one between the Zuni Pueblo people and ancient Japan. Davis's theory is not mainstream in archaeology. It has not been widely accepted, but it is one of the most detailed and provocative hypotheses about trans-Pacific contact. She points out that the Zuni language is a linguistic isolate, not clearly related to neighboring languages. Zuni cultural practices, certain ritual symbols, and even reported patterns in blood type distribution and endemic diseases differ strikingly from surrounding southwestern tribes. Davis has suggested parallels between Zuni religious iconography and elements found in East Asian, including Japanese, religious symbolism. She has even speculated that medieval Japanese Buddhist priests or other voyagers could have crossed the Pacific in the 13th century, eventually migrating inland to the southwest and contributing culturally or genetically to Zuni society. Davis's case rests on a mix of anthropological observations, comparative symbolism, and biological speculation, not on definitive archaeological or genetic evidence. Critics note that language isolates can arise through centuries of internal development and isolation, not necessarily external influence. Cultural parallels can be superficial or coincidental, rather than evidence of historical contact. Unsourced symbolism or subjective similarity is not reliable proof. No Japanese artifacts from the relevant era have been found in Zuni archaeological contexts. And yet, the idea captures the imagination. A small band of travelers, pushed by winds and storms, making landfall on the Pacific coast, and then journeying across forests and deserts to the heart of the continent. Among the Makah, whose territory sits at the northwestern tip of what is now Washington state, stories exist of outsiders arriving by sea in strange boats, sometimes bearing metal. These accounts became especially significant in the 19th century, when oral history and written documentation intersected. In 1832, a Japanese merchant vessel carrying rice and bound for Edo was blown off course. For months and without a mast or rudder, the northern Pacific Ocean currents carried the ship. During this time, the crew survived off desalinated seawater and the rice that was aboard their ship. Many died from scurvy. After 14 months in 1834, the ship arrived at Cape Alava, the westernmost point of Washington's Olympic Peninsula. The three survivors were Iwakichi, 29 years old, Kyukichi, 16 years old, and Otokichi, then 15 years old. The three castaways were quickly enslaved by the Makah Indian tribe. Eventually, the three castaways were handed over to John McLaughlin, the chief factor for the Columbia District at the Hudson's Bay Company. This illustration, made in 1849, depicts Otokichi dressed in Western clothing, presumably acquired after he was handed over to John McLaughlin. If events like the 1834 encounter between the Japanese castaways and the Makah Indians occurred centuries earlier, they would leave little archaeological trace. Wooden boats decay quickly. Iron rusts. Human remains disappear into soil and sea. What might remain are stories, and perhaps a tool or two, absorbed into local use and memory. Today, the consensus among archaeologists and geneticists is clear that there is no definitive evidence of sustained pre-Columbian contact between Japan and the Americas. The Jōmon-related pottery resemblance in Ecuador is most parsimoniously explained as parallel invention, not trans-Pacific diffusion. The Zuni-Japanese connection remains a speculative, controversial hypothesis, intriguing but not confirmed. And legends of castaways on the Pacific Northwest coast reflect valuable indigenous oral traditions, not direct proof of historical drift voyages from Japan, but reminders of how cultures remember the sea. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed my documentary, don't forget to like and subscribe, and check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/World Chronicles.